Ryan, since you're first on the poster, why don't you go first? Welcome everybody to the session on friendship with God, Seneca and Shaftesbury. And the first presenter will be Ryan Darr from Princeton University. As usual, we'll have about a half an hour talk and then about a half an hour for discussion. Ryan, would you like to begin?
Great. Yeah, thank you. I'm gonna go ahead.
Do you need to share the screen?
I do. Yeah, that's what I'm trying to do now.
Excellent. It's working.
Is that working?
Yes.
Great. Okay. All right. Well, first of all, I just want to thank the organizers. It's great to be here. Thanks for giving me the chance to share work. So the topic I'm going to talk about today is, as it says, friendship and God, or friendship with God in Shaftesbury's The Moralist. But before I start the talk, I thought I would just say a brief word about my interests in this topic, or sort of where this paper comes out of. I am working on a book in early modern British ethics, the topic of which is the kind of role of theology and the origins of utilitarianism. And one of the major themes that runs through that is the question of the relationship of divine and human morality, whether or not God's morality should be understood on the same terms as human morality. If so, how are the different questions like that? And Shaftesbury has a place in that story. And part of what I'm doing in this paper is sort of wrestling with what exactly to say about Shaftesbury on this point. So the topic of this is not divine and human morality in Shaftesbury, but you're going to kind of see how that question is in the background here. And I raise it just because even though it's not exactly what the paper's on, it may inform the conversation. Okay, so here's what I'm going to do in this paper. First, I want to frame the dialogue and the two central issues at stake. The problem, which in the Moralists, the two central issues at stake, which I take to be the problem of evil and the question of the good for human beings. Then I want to discuss the notion of friendship with God that emerges and the role it plays in resolving each of these two central issues. And then finally, I want to raise a potential tension in the dialogue that arises at the intersection of these two central issues. And so a way to put the question that I'm going to be considering at the end does the resolution of the problem of evil threaten to undermine friendship with God and thus the possibility of attaining the human good? And I'm going to suggest that it does. Just a brief word about the Moralists. It was written in 1704, published in Characteristics in 1711. It's the final treatise of characteristics. It comes just after the inquiry, and then before the miscellaneous reflections, the end, the characteristics. And it's written as a philosophical dialogue that's given in a letter from one character to another, and I'll say more about that. And then I just have on here a quote by Michael Gill. He says, if you had said to Shaftesbury that you could only read one of his books, The Moralists is what he would have given you. He thought of it as his magnum opus, the work that best captured both the essence and scope of his thought. And I think that's right. It's not the work that we most often read now, but I think this is a true characterization of how he thought about it. Okay, so the first issue at stake I want to discuss is the problem of evil. So I don't love the phrase "the problem of evil." I think it makes something singular or sound singular that's not actually singular. But you know what I mean when I use it. This issue comes up right from the beginning of the work. So as I said, it's the Moralist is written as a letter from Philocles, one of the characters who's a kind of non-dogmatic skeptic, to Palamon, a friend of his who is a kind of a noble person but interested in philosophy. And he begins by giving the rationale for why he's writing what he's writing. And the rationale comes from a previous conversation Palamon and Philocles had. And the topic of the conversation is evil. So in the dialogue of this conversation that he provides, Palamon has this rant is the wrong word, lament. He says, "O wretched state of mankind, hapless nature, thus to have erred in thy chief workmanship, wretched mortal, ill to himself, and cause of ill to all. And Philocles, being a kind of skeptic, plays both sides of this conversation for a while until finally Philemon pins him down and forces him to give an answer. And here's what Philocles says. Much is alleged in answer to show why nature errs, and how she came thus impotent and erring from an unerring hand. But I deny she errs, and when she seems most ignorant or perverse in her productions, I assert her even then as wise and provident as in her goodliest works. For 'tis not then that men complain of the world's order, or abhor the fact of things, when they see various interests mixed and interfering, natures subordinate of different kinds opposed to one another, and in their different operations submitted the higher to the lower. 'Tis on the contrary from this order of inferior and superior things that we admire the world's beauty, founded thus on contrarieties, while from such various and disagreeing principles, a universal concord is established. Thus, in the several orders of terrestrial forms, a resignation is required, a sacrifice and mutual yielding of natures one to another. The vegetables by their death sustain the animals, and animal bodies dissolved enrich the earth and raise again the vegetable world. The numerous insects are reduced by the superior kinds of birds and beasts, and these again are checked by man, who in his turn submits to other natures and resigns his form, a sacrifice in common to the rest of things. And if in natures so little exalted or preeminent above each other, the sacrifice of interests can appear so just, how much more reasonably may we infer natures be how much more reasonably may all inferior natures be subjected to the superior nature of the world. So you get a picture here of a kind of mutual subordination of things one to another and all to the good of the whole. The problem seems to be that humans don't recognize that they're also to be subordinating to the whole. That's what leads to Palemon's lament. And Palemon is awed by this response, and he needs to know, or he requests to know, where did this come from? How did you learn this? And as it turns out, Philocles was just returning from a trip to the country where he was visiting his friend Theocles, and that's the source of this idea. So Palemon requests this all to be written down, and that's where the letters come from. Okay. When we get to the conversation itself between Philocles and Theocles, what we find is evil is not actually the topic of conversation. It's rather happiness or the good for human beings. Now, I think it's fitting that Shaftesbury does this. I mean, he doesn't say why he does this, but I think it's fitting that his philosophical hero, Theocles, would be concerned about happiness and not about speculation. I think the way he sees philosophy, the way he describes philosophy, is concerned with happiness, a kind of art of life, and not with abstract speculation. And so I don't think he wants his chief character treating evil in a kind of speculative mode. At the same time, by framing the dialogue with this prior concern, he's clearly highlighting evil as a concern that he's going to address. So that's why I'm framing this as a kind of intersection of two concerns, both evil and then the question about what's the good for human beings. And I'll just note that I see this as sort of addressing two lingering issues from the inquiry into virtue and merit. One being the way Shaftesbury describes theism in the inquiry presupposes that, or theism just means that there is no real ill in the world. And given that Shaftesbury claims to be a theist, this is something that requires explanation. He doesn't explain at all how there could be no real ill in the world. I'll say also, by the way, on this point, Shaftesbury uses the word ill rather than evil. And I'm taking that to be more or less equivalent. But that's something I've wondered about. It might be interesting if that comes up in our discussion to think more about that, the use of the word ill. And then the second is the argument of book 2 of the inquiry that virtue is the best path to happiness. And the way I see this argument in the inquiry, it remains sort of probabilistic at best. And I think part of what's going on in this dialogue of Theocles is sort of, again, completing the argument that was left. Okay, so the conversation between Philocles and Theocles is on the human good, which turns out to be constant friendship. So here's a kind of brief overview of how the conversation goes. Philocles says, there can be no good which is regular or constant. Happiness is a thing out of the way and only to be found in wandering. So the thought here is that there is no good that's constant, no good that's lasting. If we're going to find happiness, we have to try to do it from jumping to thing. For anything to be a true good, it would have to be a constant good. And this is a point that both interlocutors accept. But Theocles undertakes to prove that there actually is such a constant good that's available for human beings, and that can be the source of happiness. And so Theocles says, "Tell me, my friend, if ever you were weary of doing good to those you loved. Say when you ever found it unpleasing to serve a friend. Would it be, therefore, what would it be, therefore, if all life were in reality but one continued friendship, and could be made one such entire act? Here surely would be that fixed and constant good you sought." And Philocles accepts this, that would be the case, that we never tire of friendship, we never tire of doing good to those we love, but doesn't think that friendship can fill a life. And Theocles suggests what we need is a higher object of friendship. So he offers two, mankind or nature. There's a little bit of equivocation between these two in the dialogue. What he seems to do is highlight mankind first, and over time start saying mankind or nature, and then eventually he's clearly talking about nature. I take it that he's just kind of working his way to the more abstract. And you can see in this next quote why he would need to try to work up to the most abstract. Philocles objects, "I could love the individual, but not the species. This was too mysterious, too metaphysical an object for me. In short, I could love nothing of which I had not some sensible material image." And so the word here is that perhaps mankind or nature could be good objects of friendship, but they're too abstract, and we can't be friends with something so abstract. Theocles says, "You might have the same indulgence for nature or mankind as the people of old Rome." And here he's referring to Philocles' love of the people of Rome, which he says whom he says Philocles loved under the idea of the genius of the people, a kind of quasi-personified notion of the whole of the people. And he thinks a genius of this type might be what you need for nature or for mankind as well. So that ends the first day of their conversation. And the second then is focused on supplying this notion of the genius of nature, who can be the object of constant and uninterrupted friendship that would then be the human good. They meet for the second day of conversation in the woods, and Theocles begins talking about trees, and particularly what constitutes the oneness or the form of the tree, which he says lies in a sympathizing of parts, a plain concurrence in one common end, and to the support, nourishment, and propagation of so fair a form. And trees aren't unique in this. There are in nature many such forms, he thinks. So he goes on then to argue, this is the next quote, "If nature can present us with so many innumerable instances of particular forms, who share this simple principle by which they are really one, live, act, and have a nature or genius peculiar to themselves and provident for their own welfare, how shall we at the same time overlook this in the whole and deny the great and general one of the world?" Okay, so the argument then is that the world itself forms one, has a unity in the same way that a tree has a unity. And he also argues that the unity of the one is going to have to include mind in the same way our unity includes mind. He says, "Each understands and thinks the best he can for his own purpose, he for himself, I for another self, and who, I beseech you, for the whole? No one, nothing at all." Okay, and that's just a kind of snippet of this argument that the unity of the whole is going to include mind as well. And so after this kind of ascent to recognizing the unity of the whole and the fact that there's a mind to the whole, Philocles recognizes finally that here is the object of friendship he's been looking for. he says, you have indeed made good your part of the condition and may now claim me for apostolate. Okay, so it's the genius of nature is in some ways analogous to the genius of Rome, but for Shaftesbury, it's not just a kind of representation of a whole, it's an actual kind of personal mind of the whole. Well, I suppose whether personal is the right word is a question, but it's a mind of the whole. So the human good then lies in friendship with this genius, or as he otherwise calls him, God. But what is this friendship? And here, Shaftesbury is really not very clear. So we don't get many details on this. We can think back to the way the dialogue starts, or the way Theocles' answer starts, where he says, "Tell me, my friend, if ever you were weary of doing good to those you loved. Say if you ever found it unpleasing to serve a friend." I quoted that already, where the idea seems to be friendship is doing good to someone you love, or serving someone you love. And so presumably friendship with the genius of nature or with God is going to look something like that. The one place we get something more specific comes in this next quote, where he says, this again is Theocles, he says, "The particular mind should seek its happiness in conformity with the general one, and endeavor to resemble it in its highest simplicity." And how does the particular mind do this? It does so if it cooperates with the general mind to the general good, and strives to will according to the best of wills. So we can see this as an application of the idea of, in a sense, doing good to the friend. To do good to God in this sense would be to cooperate with God to the general good that God wills, to strive to will according to the way God wills. And what is it that the general mind wills then? This last quote, the general mind wills its own advantage and good, the good of all in general. And what is for the good of all in general is just and good. Okay, so to will what the general mind wills would be then to will the general mind's good, which is the good of all in general. The question then is how can we understand how friendship with God is the source of human happiness? And we've sort of already seen enough to see where this goes. What we can say is that friendship with God provides an object, or a friendship with God can fill one's entire life. So God can be an object of friendship that fills one's entire life, an ever-present object of one's highest social affections. There's never a point in one's life in which one can't be friends with God, can't be doing good to God by cooperating and willing in God's general willing. But I think in this, I think, could be seen to kind of complete the book of, the Inquiry, book 2, where Shaftesbury argues that virtue consists in happiness comes from the social affections. And here we have a kind of highest social affection, this friendship with God that's also a willing of the good of the whole, and happiness is found in this friendship. But I think there's also another way that friendship with God can be seen to be part of happiness. And this is that Shaftesbury says the friend of God can rejoice in all that happens. So Theocles argues here in this next quote, "Know that every particular good produces what is good to itself, unless something foreign disturbs or hinders it, either by overpowering and corrupting it within, or by violence from without. If, therefore, every particular nature be thus constantly and unerringly true to itself, and certain to produce only what is good for itself, and conducing to its own right state, shall not the general one, the nature of the whole, do full as much? Shall that alone miscarry or fail? Or is there anything foreign which should at any time do violence upon it, or force it out of its natural way?" And the implied answer, of course, is no. There's nothing outside the whole, and given that then the whole will unerringly will its own good will be always perfectly realized. And as a friend then of the whole, Theocles says, you ought to rest satisfied, and not only so, but be pleased and rejoice at what happens, knowing whence it comes and to what perfection it contributes. And what I think this means, so this not only conduces to happiness and that you can rejoice in all that happens, but it also means the problem of evil disappears for the friend of God. And so we see here that this, I think we can see, is the same solution that Philocles gave, but here in a practical mode rather than a theoretical mode. So the friend of God has a way to not see evil as evil. Now, this is really just kind of a sketch, but I hope you can see how broadly I'm understanding friendship with God in the Moralists, and how I'm seeing it as resolving sort of both of the two main questions. And now what I want to do is raise what I see as a potential tension in this view. And that tension is between how Shaftesbury uses the notion of friendship with God to resolve these two central questions: the problem of evil and the question of the human good. And what I want to suggest is the picture he offers seems well suited to address metaphysical or natural evil, what others at this time would have called metaphysical or natural evil. He doesn't use language like this. But what about moral evil? So recall that in Palaemon's original lament, he says, "Wretched mortal, ill to himself and cause of ill to all." A significant part of the lament has to do not simply with evils that befall us, but that evils that we do. I mean, I think the only way Shaftesbury can treat the evil of vice or moral evil is the same way he treats all other evils, which is to say, the good of the whole may require the vice of human beings, and it often does. And I say it often does simply because we have it sort of presupposed in the dialogue that there are many moral evils in the world, and anything that happens, on his view, happens for the sake of the general good. Now, I mean, he doesn't say this explicitly. I think there are some interesting questions here, but I in the end can't see how he can avoid thinking that vice is necessary for the general good. Now, and one question we could raise about this is how it fits with the argument of the inquiry. The inquiry argues that virtue consists in our harmony with the larger systems of which we are a part, but also assumes that virtue is harmony of ourselves internally. And here we seem to have a view that in many cases, anytime vice occurs, harmony with larger systems is actually coming at the cost to harmony internally. But that's not the primary question I want to focus on, although I think that's an interesting question. I want to think more internally to the moralist. So this last bullet point says, "To will the general good in friendship with God, which is the height of virtue, may paradoxically be to will our vice." Okay, that seems to me to be an implication of his view. But can we will our own vice for the sake of the general good? I don't see how we could. To will the general good in friendship with God is, as he says, to will what is good and just, and it's to put ourselves intentionally in harmony with the largest system of which we are a part, which, as I said, is for the virtue, or is for the inquiry, just what virtue is. So to will the general good, it seems, must be virtuous, meaning that what we do for the sake of the general good cannot be vicious. In other words, to will for the sake of the general good, that we be vicious, would be to will for the sake of the general good that we not will the general good, which doesn't seem like something we can do. So I think the answer has to be no, we can't will our own vice for the sake of the general good. But then we have a situation in which, for the sake of the general good, God must put an end to our friendship. That is, if we're among those whose vice is necessary. And given that we can't know whether the general good requires our vice, this possibility, it seems to me, is going to loom over any friendship with God. So what can be said to this? Shaftesbury doesn't address this at all in his public writings, but he does actually address it in his private writings. And in his Ascomata, or Philosophical Regimen, he actually raises it explicitly. And I know that there are debates on how to read the relationship between his public writings and his private writings. Many are somewhat wary of assuming the private writings are truer to his view, and I think there are good warnings, there are good reasons to not just assume that. But in a case like this, where a question arises in the public writings that we don't even know from the public writings if he's aware of, and we see him addressing it explicitly in the private writings, I think it's really interesting to see what he says. We can at least see that he's aware of it, and we can get a sense of how he might be thinking of it. So here's a passage from this is quoted from the Philosophical Regimen, and in the chapter that's gathered under the label of necessity. He says, "If I were conscious," says Epictetus, "of what was decreed me, and could be certain of what were to happen before it happened, I would will that and that only. Suppose it sickness, suppose it infamy, suppose it death. If I knew how this was to be controlled, if I knew what else was appointed, I would turn to this, and this should be the object of my aim. This I would effect, and nothing but this. But," says one, "it may thus happen that I may also will that I be wicked. Not if there were a possibility left of its being any otherwise. But if no possibility, I will, however, be pious and good. That is to say, I will be happy as long as it is allowed me, as long as I possibly can be so. If I cannot be so the moment that follows, at least I will remain so this present moment that precedes, and will join my applause to what God has for the best decreed. Excuse me. For to will against that which is best, and to will what is impossible, what else were this but to be wicked and miserable? Now, that every creature should seek its good and not its misery is necessary in itself, nor can it be supposed the will of God that a creature should do otherwise than thus. For this is contradictory and consequently impossible even with God. So that my will toward virtue is irrefragable and immutable, but toward life, death, poverty, riches, and all other exterior things, it is variable upon occasion." So for Shaftesbury, if I knew my vice were necessary, I should still will the general good while I can. And when I become vicious, as I must, I will still will my own good as is necessary, but will no longer believe that my good lies in virtue, and thus will fail to be happy. Now, it may be that it may be the case that this is the best Shaftesbury can say, but if we take this answer seriously, it's no longer clear to me that we can, in fact, join our wills to God's in the way the moralist suggests. We don't know what the general good requires or what it will require of us. We do know, however, that it may require the one thing that we cannot will. And for this reason, it seems to me, we cannot will the general good as such, but we can only will it conditionally. That is conditional on its not including our vice and thus our misery. And this is to confess that we do not truly will the same end as God, that we cannot conform our minds fully to the general mind, as Shaftesbury suggests, and thus that friendship with God, at least in the full sense envisioned by Theocles, is not possible for us. It's illuminating that Shaftesbury says that it's not just creatures who cannot will their misery. The same, he says, is true of God. But for God, of course, no case can arise in which the general good conflicts with his happiness. And this is because for God, unlike us, God is not part of the whole. God, willing only the good of the whole, treats every part for just what it is, a part. But we, as parts, cannot, I think, in the final analysis, treat ourselves as parts. We can accept the subordination of our bodies, our loved ones, even our species. All of these we can accept subordination to the general good, but we cannot accept the subordination of our wills to the general good. But this subordination of our wills is necessary, since they are part of the whole, and God will always require it of us. So another way to put the point that I'm raising is this. Our friendship with God is limited by the fact that God treats us as parts in a way that we cannot treat ourselves. Now, a final question that we should ask is, does this matter for our happiness? And I'm not entirely sure what to say here, but I think there are at least two reasons to think that it does. One is that, as Theocles says, the human good must be constant if we are to attain happiness. And while friendship with God may turn out to be constant if we're lucky, looming over it is the worry that it cannot be, that our happiness is incompatible with the general good that we must seek if we are to be happy. And second, as I've indicated, it seems to me that this is not a friendship in the full sense. We cannot fully join our will to God, but only, as I said, conditionally, hoping that God does not will the one thing that we cannot will, our own misery. And thus, we cooperate with God, exercising our social affections to the highest degree, but without the assurance that we really want what we are cooperating for, without the assurance that what we are working for is compatible with our own happiness. And for both these reasons, I think Shaftesbury's resolution of the problem of evil threatens his account of happiness. Okay, that's where I'm gonna stop, and I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Okay, thank you very, very much. The first question seems to be Dennis Dagci.
Well, thank you for the talk. So, in your description of Shaftesbury's views, it appeared that the focus was on God's general will, God's willing the general good of the whole, but not much talk was given of God's willing the good of the particular people. Now, it appears that when one articulates a position like that, God doesn't reciprocate the affections of particular people loving God or not loving God, so someone who's a friend of God on this view would love God and would join with the object of his will, with the divine will, but the affection sources of love would not be reciprocated if that's articulated in that. But one might think that this pushes the notion of friendship too far, where it requires a mutual affection. Or perhaps one argues that that is not the case, or that this should be an exception to that, and particularly, but there needs to be some sort of argument there. So one might perhaps say that for the highest happiness for someone like Shaftesbury is joining of one's will with the object of divine will, but one might not take this to be a kind of friendship. But this is a different kind of notion. So what makes it a friendship for Shaftesbury?
Yeah, thanks. No, that's great. So as I said, I don't think he's all that clear on what actually it is that he means by friendship here. And so I'm in some ways reading quite a bit from the analogy he's drawing with ordinary friendships, which he says are goods that we can never grow tired of. And there, the emphasis is just on the doing of good to the other, and that we love the other that we're doing good to. There actually isn't, as far as I recall, an emphasis on mutual love, although you would presuppose that he's thinking about mutual love when he's thinking about friendship. But I did not actually mean to say, and I'm not sure if this is how you heard me, I didn't mean to say that the way in which we're limited in the extent to which we can be friends with God requires God's mutual affection for us. I see how that in the talking of God treats us as parts, but we can't treat ourselves that way. It may sound a bit like I'm saying what's lacking here is God's mutual return for our affection. But what I really want to be emphasizing is that, I mean, I think that's an interesting question, whether that should matter. And you're right that Shaftesbury says nothing, as far as I know, about God's concern for particular individuals. God's always willing the general good, and the individuals are always going to be treated, as I understand it, as parts of the whole that forms that general good. But my thought was that apart from the issue of whether God has appropriate affection for us, we simply can't will unconditionally the same thing that God wills. That there has to be a condition on the extent to which we can join our wills to God's, because what God wills may contain the one thing that we can't will. It may contain vice, and we don't know if it will. And so that was where I was sort of focusing on the limitation, and not on the fact that we don't receive reciprocal affection from God. I'm not entirely confident that I'm getting at what you're
One
asking.
short,
Yeah.
you were focusing on the human side of things, what the problem would be if for us to will the general good in the way that
Right.
God wills. My question was about the other side. Can God will the part of what our affection to be a friend in a perhaps more extended sense than Shaftesbury really uses in this. I'm bringing the mutual affection into it. Perhaps Shaftesbury doesn't think this in general. So that's would be the right way to resist that. Shaftesbury has a different conception of friendship.
Just a reminder, Ryan, did you want to answer that?
Yeah, I mean,
I interrupted you.
Well, just to say, I mean, I think you're right that this doesn't get directly addressed, the extent to which God could have a mutual affection. And I mean, as I said, I think I don't see a way to avoid the thought that God treats us as a part, which isn't to say God doesn't care about our good, because Shaftesbury does think the general good is in some sense the good of all, because as parts, in some sense, our good lies in the good of the whole, but still it's our misery. I mean, vice is misery for him, and insofar as the general good requires our vice, God has to be willing to sacrifice us. And Shaftesbury uses the language of sacrifice. And the language of sacrifice serves him well, as I said, when he's talking about things like natural evil, the things that he clearly wants to say we ought to be sacrificing for the general good. But the thing we can't sacrifice, as I said, is our own will, I think, on his terms. And he even says that God couldn't will that we will our own misery. So it's a kind of necessity that we will our good. Even God couldn't want us to will our own misery. It can only be that it's necessary for us at some points when our vice is necessary to start to think that our happiness lies in something else. And in that sense, to break off friendship with God.
Let me remind you, if you do want to ask a question, to send a brief note in the chat saying briefly what it is that you wanted to ask about so that we can perhaps group questions together. But the next question is Dolores Yoritzo. Dolores?
Sorry, I just wanted to follow up on Dennis's line of argument. So in antiquity, the classic three kinds of friendship that you get in Aristotle goes through many transformations in the medical literature. And it's always striking to read in Galen that Galen has very clear views about this, that you should have friends that are better than you, because you can't become more perfect as a human being unless there's someone who's, as it were, higher on the scale. So ultimately, if you follow that logic through, then God would be the highest person on the scale. So is there a way to reconcile this kind of logic in Shaftesbury with this ancient view about friendship?
That's a great question. Could you just say a little bit more about in what way you're thinking it might reconcile it?
What way, you mean what way to combine, or what way to?
Is your thought that we become, I mean, we want to be friends with the highest thing, which is God, and that's going to make us better. I mean, I think he doesn't make a point like that, as far as I know. But it's true that we want to be friends with the highest thing, and in doing that is going to be the height of our virtue.
Right.
But are you asking whether that can then resolve the kinds of tensions that I'm raising? Because I'm not quite sure I see
because
how that
well, because there's a kind of drag on the rise to perfection and virtue with an obsession about evil, and so in some ways it comes down to the problem of acrasia, right, where the thing that draws us away from virtue is not being able to be guided by divine grace or be divided by the kind of inspiration that we have from the friendship with God, which draws us, like Socrates, to the position where seeing the good is doing the good. So evil comes in when there's a tension between seeing the good and doing the good. It's a kind of classic acrasia problem.
Right. Well, I suppose, I mean, what I'm highlighting is that it may turn out to be the case, and seems that it will turn out to be the case for many people, that their vice is going to be necessary for God to, and God's going to always will the general good. Everything that happens is part of the general good, and so all vice that happens is necessary to the general good. So whether we explain that by acrasia or something else, if for those of us who are among those whose vice is necessary for the general good, and none of us can know whether that's us, we're always going to have this looming possibility that we can't ultimately be friends with God. We can't ultimately share in God's ends, which is how I'm understanding what it is to be friends with God. And it seems to me that there's no account of God being higher than us and drawing us up to a higher virtue through friendship that's going to avoid that possibility looming over friendship with God.
And to what extent does original sin play in Shaftesbury's account? Because that sounds very much like a kind of earlier 17th century idea of original sin.
I mean, I don't see original sin having a place in Shaftesbury. I don't think I don't think he accepts original sin. I mean, in the inquiry, he seems to think our affections are naturally good and harmoniously integrated with the good of the whole. And I raised the thought at one point that this picture in the Moralist also seems a bit at odds with that. Again, just the thought that vice might be necessary and is necessary to the good of the whole suggests that often our moral affections actually have to be disharmonious for the sake of larger systems. But in general, no, I think the only explanation for vice is that it's necessary for the good of the whole. Everything that happens is perfectly necessary for the good of the whole, including vice. And I don't think a doctrine of original sin plays a role in explaining vice.
Thanks so much.
Let me make just a brief comment in here. Do you know, Ryan, Tanya Luhrmann's book, When God Talks Back?
I'm familiar with it, but I haven't read it.
Well, this is what I actually think of as being friends with God. It's about certain groups of American evangelicals who believe that one literally talks with God. And in a certain way, this is, well, no, I won't say that. I was about to say this is Pascal's vision of our relationship with God, but that's actually a little bit different. It just seems to me, I mean, to go back to Dennis's comment, that friendship is not the right word for the kind of relationship that Shaftesbury is talking about as what it is that we should cultivate with God. It just seems like a perverse thing to call friendship. But
yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, I is it again because it's not two-sided in the right way? Is that why?
well, the thing is, there are lots of two-sided relations that aren't friendship as well. Yeah, it does have to be kind of two-sided. But at the same time, I mean, one get rivalry is also often two-sided. That's not necessarily friendship. But there does have to be a kind of back and forth and a kind of personal relationship where, I mean, this is the thing about the group of people that Tanya Luhrmann was talking about, which is people feel that they have a personal relationship with God, and there is a give and take, and God gives, personal advice in their day-to-day lives, and that kind of a personal relationship is, I think, something that is important to something being friendship.
Yeah, no,
It's not just the evangelical Christians who think that. Jews and Catholics think that as well. So I mean that they can talk to God and have somehow in prayer you get a kind of sign from God about which direction you're going if you need to make a difficult decision or something like
Well,
that.
a sign is I think different from this kind of relationship too, from a friendship.
Yeah.
And you
No,
don't
I agree with you.
friend, but
Yeah, no, this is interesting. I mean, I agree with you that the relationship doesn't seem best characterized as friendship. Well, one thing you're making me think that I hadn't thought before is so he clearly frames the way he arrives at this idea of the human good through the lens of friendship. So it starts with the idea we're never tired of doing good to a friend, and then he starts to talk about friendship with mankind and trying to provide an object of that friendship. But by the time he gets to the genius of nature and our relationship to the genius of nature, he doesn't use the language of friendship very often anymore. In fact, I should go back and sort of track how often. I mean, it may be that what he's doing is providing us a path to seeing our good as lying in a relationship like this, but the notion of friendship ought to get left behind in the process of reaching this point. I mean, that actually may be a good way to think about what he's doing. But again, I'd have to go back and look at occurrences of friendship and whether they drop off at some point in the dialogue. But I mean, I still think he wants something analogous to a friendship, something by which it's plausible to move from the happiness we take in doing good to our friend to our highest good being in this kind of relationship with God, whether we call that friendship or not.
Hanoch.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Ron, for a very interesting talk. Before I read my comment, I want to apologize to Dana. I have to leave soon. Regrettably, I won't be able to stay for your talk. My question was not directly about the friendship and its limitations, but about a problem in Shaftesbury general theodicy, as I see. I'll read it. How can Shaftesbury's line of thought help us choose anything to direct our lives? Whatever happens is best, even the things chosen by those who don't deliberate, even if we choose at random, or the worst thing we thought possible, that's the best thing that could happen. What we will take to be the apparent good is often not the real good, because we often fail to realize it, and still it's best. And so what should we choose? I think that the theodicy, as far as I understood it, leaves us without an answer to this question.
Yeah, thanks. That's a really good question. And I don't think anywhere in the course of the Moralist he addresses this kind of question. I think how we should understand what he thinks on this point partly has to do with which of his writings we prioritize. I mean, the inquiry would be the natural place to look. And there he argues that virtue is going to be it's going to consist in an internal harmony of our affections. As I said, that also has to consist in a larger harmony with the larger systems of which we're a part. But at one point he has this line where he sort of accepts that we're never going to know whether we're in harmony with larger systems, and just says, still, we always know whether our affections are in internal harmony, and that ought to guide our actions. And so I think what we're going to do in the way in which we're going to exercise our friendship with God is best as possible to be virtuous. He definitely doesn't think that we can know what the general good requires, so we can't really cooperate except insofar as we can do what seems to be virtuous based on the harmony of our affections. If you prioritize his private writings, I mean, it's much more stoic. And I mean, again, it's going to recognize that we're not going to know the general good, and he focuses on, I mean, it seems to be a kind of view where you want what you think is appropriate to your nature, but you only want it sort of conditionally on it actually being what happens, because what happens is what's right. But in general, you're exactly right that trying to do what God wills can't guide our actions, because whatever happens is going to be that. And so we live according to the harmony of our nature.
Great. Are there any further questions that people would like to raise? Then let's thank Ryan.
Thank you so much.
And move on to the second talk this afternoon. Dana Jalobeanu, Friendship with God in Seneca's Epistles, Philosophical Reflections, and Literary Devices. Dana.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you all for accepting this talk in the Princeton-Bucharest Seminar in Early Modern Philosophy, which is, after all, a seminar in early modern philosophy. And I was thinking while listening to the previous talk that if Shaftesbury used friendship in ways that Dan called a perverse way, just wait to see what Seneca has to say or what I'm making of it. I feel I need to start with a kind of confession and explanation. In my secret life during the past years, I wrote a sort of guide and commentary of Seneca's letters. And this in turn came at the end of many years in which I worked on Seneca's influences on early modern philosophy, but this is the first time I'm giving a Seneca paper. It's the first time I'm trying to put things together and just talk about a concept in these letters, the concept of friendship. I tried to make it as non-technical as possible, and I'm going just to expose a general problem, ask some questions, give some answers, leave some questions unanswered. And because I've been teaching 6 hours today, I just refuse to do more slides. I just want to talk, see you, maintain some sort of conviviality here. And for those of you who want to follow what I'm saying and look at quotes, I gave you a link to a Google document with the paper that you can, I'm actually going to put it again in the chat here for people who joined later. So you can basically follow. There is the draft of my talk. Apologize for the typos, it's just the first draft, but you can follow the quotes. Friendship is one of the main themes in Seneca's letter to Lucilius. And some may say perhaps it is the main theme. And yet to date, scholars fail to agree on many of its details. Debates range over the question whether Seneca's conception of friendship is Stoic, whether it is influenced by the Epicureans or by Plato's early dialogues, or whether it was constructed in opposition with Cicero's conception of friendship. Other questions regard the nature and function of friendship. It is a relationship among the sages, or maybe the right kind of relationship between the wise and God. Is friendship a form of the exercise of virtue or a pedagogic tool for the philosopher? To date, scholars even fail to agree over the question which particular letters of the 124 letters are letters on friendship. In this talk, I suggest that there are 2 possible reasons for such a diversity of interpretation. First, the theme of friendship is central to the very particular interplay between philosophy and literature, which represents the main characteristic of the letters. Second, scholars tend to assume that Seneca develops in the latter the same conception of friendship and friendship with God as in his earlier works. My purpose is to investigate the first and question the second of these assumptions. Now, more than 10 years ago, I wrote a paper on Seneca and Bacon on this theme of friendship, trying to show that a Senecan model of the community of the wise lies behind Bacon's brotherhood of light and the model society of the New Atlantis. On that occasion, I also assumed that Seneca has basically a very slightly modified Stoic conception of friendship. According to this conception, friendship is a relationship between the wise, wisdom and virtue being prerequisite for it. I quote it here from Marcia Golish. The sages are friends among themselves and are friends with God. In fact, the sage is ontologically equal with God. Between the sage and God, there is only a small difference relating to their temporal duration. Sages are gods who do not live forever, but the community of sages do, or can extend its life, if not forever, at least for a very, very long time. De Brevitate Vitae gives a very vivid picture of this community of the wise, which transcends spatio-temporal borders. It is a community of friends, a republic of equals, inclusive enough to allow those who are not yet amongst the sages to join in. The philosopher simply wishes to live among the wise, to live daily in this ideal companionship through a life of reading and study. I call this the passive model of friendship. It is passive because Seneca depicts it using the metaphor of adoption. The aspiring philosopher can choose adoption in this noble household of the wise and gods. That's a quotation from the Brevitate Vitae. The resulting life is a life of practice and communion with books, but perhaps also with people, one in which you also pursue the model of these distinguished friends living, as it were, under their supervision. A Stoic spiritual exercise to think you are living under the eye of a master or a friend. Moreover, in this passive model of friendship, some of the virtue or good habits so natural in the republic of the sages and gods might influence the new adept through a process of diffusion and contagion, similar with that through which bad habits or passions of the crowds are supposed to influence and contaminate even the best minds. This passive model of friendship represents a basis for one's own moral progress, because even surrounded by distinguished friends and models of moral behavior, the disciple still needs to work hard to struggle to be on the right track, to keep his eyes steadily fixed upon virtue. Moreover, the disciple needs to do this every day, which basically means a sort of at least partial withdrawal from the active social life into a library. We can find this passive model of friendship in Seneca's letters as well. This is the usual interpretation of the much quoted passage from letter 104, which claims, I quote, "Make a conversion to better models, live with either of the Catos or with Laelius or Tubero, or if you prefer to cohabit with Greeks, spend your time with Socrates or Zeno. The former will teach you, if necessary, how to die, the latter how to die before it is necessary." In many ways, this is the concept of friendship that we can find again in early modern philosophy, especially in that kind of early modern philosophy that is influenced by the Stoics. Now, is there more to it than this? I think there is. I think we can find in the letters what I call an active conception of friendship. And this is what I will try to unearth in my talk. But let me first begin by saying how I read Seneca's letters. This is one of the most widely read texts in the history of philosophy, and there are many conflicting and extremely diverse interpretations of it. My reading follows a line of interpretation that began in the Renaissance. Maybe we can say that it was inaugurated by Justus Lipsius' edition of Seneca, 1605. Lipsius takes the letters to be a textbook of moral philosophy. He also emphasizes their literary character and suggests that Lucilius is a fictional character invented by Seneca as an interlocutor for his philosophical dialogue. And we can find a similar reading in Francis Bacon, who in a planned letter dedicatory of his essays to Prince Henry, describes his enterprise as following in the model of Seneca's Epistles. I'm here just giving a very abridged part of the quote. He's saying, I choose to write down certain brief notes that I'm calling essays. The word is late, so the essays is a recent word, but the thing is ancient. For Seneca's epistles to Lucilius, if you mark them well, are but essays. That is, dispersed meditations, though conveyed in the form of epistles. I think we have here already the two directions of interpretation recurrent in the fictionalist reading of the letters. The textbook reading will look for a unity of purpose and method. The dispersed meditation kind of reading will try to identify the subject matter of each of Seneca's little essays. Hence the persistent and recurrent attempts to give titles to each of the letters, which is still something that we received in modern scholarship. Now, in my reading, I side rather with Lipsius than with Bacon on this matter. I argue for a sequential reading of the letters, a reading which assume some degree of inner coherence. And I also think that in a good tradition, modern as well as contemporary, that letters propose a novel form of philosophizing, a fictional philosophical dialogue with theatrical elements, much like Plato's dialogues narrated in the third person. Within this new form of philosophizing, Seneca attempts to answer a difficult question, the question of personal individual freedom. The question is formulated in the very first lines of the first letter with the deceptive simplicity of a moral precept. This vindicate tibi, set yourself free. Or rather, this means become your own master. Revindicate the right of ownership over your own person from whoever kept you so far in a state of slavery, and take possession upon yourself, as has been explained many times. Here, Seneca uses the vocabulary of setting a slave free. It's a legal vocabulary of setting someone free. It's just that instead of setting a slave free, you set yourself free. It is tempting to read the letters in the context of Seneca's own life and struggles. Written in the last 2 years of his life, or as some claim, in the very last years of his life, the letters bear not only the mark of a change of style in comparison with his earlier dialogues, but also they have a sense of urgency, of impending death, a death that becomes more and more the supreme vindication of the philosophical life. Now, there is an interesting passage in an earlier dialogue on the happy life where Seneca writes, I speak of virtue not of myself. When I blame vices, I first of all reprove my own. And here's the important thing, when I may possibly, I will live as I ought. Now one can imagine that in 64, 65, withdrawn at least from politics, Seneca found some time at last to take up this challenge and to live as one ought, in a preparation of imminent death. And one can read the letters as a document translating this experience. In his vivid depiction of Seneca's death, Tacitus makes his hero claim something like, I have left you my life as a model. And this is somewhat ironic if we think of the life Seneca lived in the first century Rome as a tutor and counselor of Nero. But it's somehow strangely accurate if one thinks of the life of the character Seneca, the one that lives in the passage pages of the letters. This Seneca, the main character of the letter, is someone who managed to set himself free and die a philosophical death. And the letters document this story and leave us with a model to follow. And I claim that the theory and practice of friendship is essential to this model. Now, after this, how do I read the letters? Let me just visit a bit the literary aspect of the text we are talking about. Because there is a cast of the letters. Like in a play, there is a large cast of dramatis personae. In addition to the two main characters, Seneca and Lucilius, we have a large gallery of portraits, one more colorfully depicted than the other. Teachers and friends, such as the aspiring Attalus, the wise Serenus, or the serene Claranus, or the Epicurean philosopher Burrus, the one who already knows how to die. Strange friends, such as Marcellinus, who bought himself an expensive and peaceful suicide, which looks more like a modern euthanasia. Vazia, the noble and rich predecessor of a sort of negative alter ego of Seneca himself, someone who found the wrong way to withdraw from politics, in the same way in which Marcellinus found the wrong way to withdraw from life. The rich and powerful Messena, whose words are as drunk and lax as his morals. All these colorful characters are used as living examples of how to live or what to avoid, how to become aware of the fundamental hypocrisy of human beings, how to distinguish between words and deeds, how to disentangle from the intertwined words, deeds, and life stories what really counts in moral evaluation, namely the intentions behind every act. In addition to friends, there are also the minor characters depicted in short and vivid portraits, which serve as exempla, Again, either good examples, such as the gladiator who finds a way to commit suicide before entering into the ring, or bad examples, such as the numerous deviant creatures who have lost their humanities and became more like beasts. Many of these characters are introduced as friends, false friends, failed friendships, potential friends who needs to be molded and transformed, and true friends. The characters of Lucilius and Seneca are pictured not only as friends to each other, but as engaged in a network of friends, or perhaps more appropriate, as we shall see in what follows, as engaged in the creative act of making and shaping friends, while being themselves molded and shaped by other friends. And what is most interesting in Seneca's stories, anecdotes about friends and friendship, is that they depict always dynamic relations. Characters reoccur in the correspondence and their role changes. And sometimes the relation with the main character changes as well. This is most clearly emphasized in the dynamic relationship between Lucilius and Seneca. So in the same famous letter in which Seneca says, I quote, "I claim you as my own, you are my own creation," we see a change from the initial relation, which was that of a master to a pupil, to another kind of relationship described in terms of two friends engaged in the same struggle on the road to virtue. I quote, "No, I'm cheering you in the race, and you in return are cheering for me." This is even clearer in letter 49, where the character Seneca takes his friend Lucilius as a moral instance and judge, and he asks Lucilius for teaching and advice. And there is a fantastic and very interesting paragraph from which I quote a bit, which is a kind of invocation of the absent friend. "Death is after me, life is on the retreat. Teach me something I can use against that. Don't let me run from death any longer. Don't let life run away from me. Encourage me to face what is difficult. Give me the serenity to accept what I cannot avoid." Sounds like a prayer here. "Expand the narrow confines of my remaining time. Teach me that the goodness of a life depends not on how long it is, but on how it is used. And that it is possible, in fact, quite common for a person to have a long life that is scarcely a life at all. Say to me before I sleep, it is possible you will not wake up. And when I rise, it is possible you will not return. And when I return, it is possible you will never leave. Dispel these shades for me, and you will find it easier to teach me the lessons I have been preparing myself to learn. Nature created us susceptible to instruction. It endowed us with reason, which, though imperfect, can be perfected." It is clear that here the master and disciple have changed their roles completely. So, what is going on in this philosophical theater? And here is where the active friendship comes in. There is an interesting, often repeated and quite striking requirement in the letters, and that's the requirement to make friends. This is described as an act of craftsmanship. And Seneca uses a plethora of metaphors for it, such as sculpting, painting, or gardening. This act of making friends follows our natural instinct for companionship and attachment, but it can have different degrees of sophistication and self-reflection according to where we are on Seneca's scale of proficiency. The sage is making friends as Phidias is making statues, using all the human stuff available to him. In a very nice paragraph, Seneca explains that if Phidias has marble, he makes statues of marble. If Phidias has wood, he will make statues of wood, and they will be equally beautiful. In fact, as letter 9 proclaims, the sage is an artist as making friends, amicitiarum artifex. The sage is self-sufficient, not in that he wants to be without a friend, but in that he is able to, by which I mean that he bears the loss with equanimity. But in truth, he will never be without a friend. So the sage always has friends. for it rests with him how quickly he gets a replacement. Just as Phidias, if he should lose one of his statues, would immediately make another, so this artist at friend making, that's the Amicearum artifacts, will substitute another in the place of the one who is lost. In making or shaping friends, the sage imitates God, the supreme artisan of the universe. Letter 9 make an interesting analogy between the self-sufficiency of God and that of the sage and their creative powers. But what sort of life the wise man has if he is left without friends when in captivity, or stranded in some foreign country, or delayed in some long voyage, or cast away on a desert island? And the answer is the kind Jupiter has at the time when the world is dissolved and all gods are mingled into one, when nature ceases its operation for a while, and he devotes himself to his own thoughts and rests in himself. What the sage does is something like that. He retreats into himself and in his own company. Okay, so the life without friends is the life that gods have in between two cycles of the universe when nothing happens. And the sage knows very well how to do that, but only if it's needed. Now, who is the subject of this act of creation? What is the material from which the wise is making friends? Clearly not the other sages, with whom he is connected by a natural bond, who are already shaped, they are already nice statues. It seems that his craftsmanship works upon human beings who are not yet sages, and thus that the sage turns other human beings into something more akin to himself. In this way, the active model of friendship basically stands for the process of teaching and learning through which one hopes to become a sage. The philosophers aim to do the same as the sage, but his craftsmanship differs in substantial way from that of the sage. The philosopher's creation is of a kind of second order. The philosopher cannot shape friends in his own image, since he is not always living according to the dictates of reason. He cannot make friends in the image of the sage, since he only has dim reflections of what is to be a sage. And yet Seneca's letters advise Lucilius to make friends. Sometimes they advise even on how to make friends. So you make friends after a careful act of deliberation, and you adopt a friend, receiving him into your heart and into your trust. Letter 3 makes a curious statement about trust. Quote, "If you believe him loyal, you will make him so." Now, this is a statement which is in such a clear contradiction with facts of our own experience that makes one wonder, what did Seneca means by making a friend? And I think that this is precisely the purpose of the very interesting but somewhat mysterious letter 3, which introduces the theme of the formative power of trust. This is fiducia. And the advice to live in plain sight or plain light, to have nothing to hide from your friends, but also to have nothing to hide from the world in general. This is a recurrent theme in Seneca's letters, the contrast between those who live in plain light and those harboring secrets, which he claims can never be free. The secrets hold them in the dark. Thus, the first purpose of making friends is to place mirrors in front of one's eyes. This act of trust discloses my acts and my intentions. By sharing them with a friend, I'm basically doing one of the familiar spiritual exercises of both Stoics and Epicureans, the exercise to live under one's eyes. As letter 11 has it, I quote, "The mind needs to have someone it can respect, someone by whose authority it can make even its privacy more reverent." But this is just half of the story, because what Seneca looks for is a double formative act of trust. By trusting the other, I'm not only acting upon myself, I'm acting upon his mind as well. The second purpose of making friends seems to be to trust the other as much as yourself. And this, Seneca claims, is the meaning of real friendship. Now, that's paradoxical because, as you well know, Stoics argue for a general attitude of suspicion towards oneself, one's motives and hidden intentions. But maybe it is precisely this pair, trust in the other and self-suspicion, that are argued for in one of Seneca's most quoted precepts. I quote, "Wisdom lies in combining the two. You should never doubt without hoping, nor hope without doubting." Letter 104. Moreover, this trust, this fiducia, does not necessarily have a temporal dimension. It is here and now that I trust the other enough to set myself under his eyes, enough to share my progress with him. This, I think, is partly clarified by letter 6, the first of the letters in which Seneca talks about his formative project in terms of a series of transfigurations, sudden and somehow discontinuous transformations on one's whole person, which can be taken as, quote, an indication that the mind, animus, has reached a better place. It is in this context that trust and sharing are brought together. And here is a quote. "If I only could share such a sudden transformation with you, that's what I would like. In that case, I would begin to have more confidence in our friendship. For it would then be true friendship that stays with people until they die, and that people die for. I can name you many people who have friends and yet without friendship. This is not the case, though, where equal willingness draw minds into a companionship of honorable intentions. How could it be? For they know that everything they have is held in common, and especially their trials." Now, friendship, therefore, seems to be something necessary to make progress on the way to virtue. And as letter 6 claims, this is how some of the sages have become who they are. They were molded by this formative friendship. Zeno molded Cleanthes, Socrates molded both Plato and Aristotle, and a whole crowd of philosophers. So this molding doesn't really act by proximity, as we will see in a moment. This formative relation, however, was not unidirectional, but bidirectional. So here is a quote: "Metrodorus, Hermarchus, and Pollianus," these are the Epicurus friends, "were made great men not by Epicurus' formal instruction, but by living together with him. Nor do I summon you to me only for your benefit. It is for my benefit as well. Each of us has much to bestow on the other." It looks thus that the philosopher proficient needs friends. It looks like the road to wisdom is not a road that one can travel alone. In this active model of friendship, the act of making friends looks like an attempt to discipline the natural instinct we all have for sociability and attachment. These natural instincts can lead to good impulses, but most of the time they are distorted and diverted by false opinions. Such is the false opinion of the usefulness of friendship held by the Epicureans, an opinion Seneca criticizes strongly, emphasizing that the true reason to make a friend is not to have someone to help and shape you, but, I quote, "to have someone I can die for, someone I can accompany into exile, someone whose life I can save even by laying down my own." Now, what do I need someone else to die for? I mean, okay, philosophy is about learning how to die, but why do I need to put this into onto someone else? I think that Seneca has 3 different arguments with which he tries to answer this question. And he also has many examples of deaths performed for the wrong reasons. Examples of people who commit suicide or go to their deaths in battle with what seems like good reasons and the correct attitude, but in fact is neither one nor the other. The most spectacular is the assisted death of Marcellinus, who looks like a philosophical suicide, but it is not. It is merely a cowardly demise of someone who is tired of living and does not dare to die properly. Letter 77 formulates a rather complex theory of good impulses to explain that generosity is somehow innate in us, and hence we see sometimes young people especially moved by generosity and heroism and trying to imitate them. This learning by contamination can lead to seemingly good acts, but these acts are not really good because their intention was not the result of a rational decision. So if someone sacrificed his life in a battle, dying for one's country because he was moved to tears by a patriotic song, or because he wants to emulate Achilles, his death is not a philosophical death. In order for it to be a philosophical death, rational reflection should precede it, and the mind has to pass judgment on that act. This does happen, and here is the second argument, when I decide to sacrifice my life to save a friend. And even if I do not die in that respective battle, the decision I took had good formative effects upon my mind. For example, I discovered the true meaning and the right application of generosity, self-sacrifice, taking the right decision. A third argument for the formative power of friendship has something to do with Seneca's general vision of the formative power of difficulties. For him, bad luck, difficult moments, and calamities are regarded as trials one has to pass. And the more trials you have, the more chances you have to learn how to live and how to die. So having friends is just multiplying these trials, because I take upon myself some of their trials and some of their calamities, some of the calamities that befell them. So I have more chances to learn. But there is a fourth argument for friendship, and this is perhaps the most interesting of all. In order to reconstruct it, we need to go back at the beginning and see what happens first when I try to set myself free. The decision is presumably followed by a process of introspection in which I attempt to see my former life and pass judgment on it, examine my passions and find ways to restrain them, investigate, examine and judge my inner reasons, bring to the light secrets and hidden motives, and so on. This is the examination of conscience. Now, what do I find at the end of this process of introspection and self-examination? Well, I find something rather worrying, as we all know, because one of the main problems one encounters in this road to freedom is that we are fundamentally unaware of who we are. Even when, as philosophers, we try to practice the Delphic precept, know thyself. Seneca vividly pictures this state of ignorance by saying that we carry with us inside a sick man. As in 28:3, realize that your present condition is like that which Virgil depicts in the Sibyl. In that moment when she is agitated and maddened, having inside her a vast spirit, not her own. The prophet bucks and thrashes, try to shake the God out of her heart. So there is an inner unknown God in the prophetess in the moment of the prophecy. And so with you, he says, you go this way and that, trying to shake off a load that becomes all the more cumbersome with movement. It's like a ship's cargo, properly stowed. It has little effect on the vessel, but if it slides around, it soon causes one side to go under. No matter how you act against yourself. You harm yourself by your very movement, for you are jostling someone who is sick. The double theme of the God within and the sick man within, it's prominent through the letters and characterize their strange agonistic anthropology. For Seneca, we are rather strange creatures. Our animus, our mind, is a part of the divine spirit. It's the God within. But this divine part lies well hidden, and discovering it is a complex and sometimes terrifying experience, because what I found at the end of any process of introspection is very far away from what I used to call myself. It is, as Darr put it, a transcendent self, generic and impersonal, even more impersonal than Socrates' daimon, because it is debatable to what extent I can call this God within my God, or even my mind. In Seneca's term, this is the best part of mind, namely the most rational part of mind, or rather the best state of the healed mind, the mind in a special state. And he uses this recurrent phrase, animus bonus rectus magnus. Okay, that's what I discovered at the end of all my searches. And this is the healed mind, the mind of the sage, is animus bonus rectus magnus. There is a permanent tension in the letters between this transcendent self, which seems to be always present inside us, which is natural to us, according to Seneca, but rarely acknowledged, rarely met, and the distorted and sick state of the mind in its human form, a mind that has been, quote, broken and sprained in so many places. Letter 104 uses friendship as a tool to get acquainted with this fundamentally unknown self, the God within. Again, the requirement is to make friends and replace those who have left. The replacement of friends who died, it's not just another act of creation. It is an exercise of self-knowledge. And here is a very nice quote. Seneca says, well, like autumn leaves, one or another of them will fall as the day passes, but their loss is easy to bear because leaves grow again. It is no different with those who you love and think of as your life delight. So it's no different when your friends die. They can be replaced, even though they are not reborn. But they will not be the same, comes the answer. And Seneca replies, even you yourself will not be the same. Every day changes you, and every hour. But when other people are snatched away, the change is quite obvious. Whereas in your own case, this escapes notice because it is not happening on the outside. Other people are taken for us, but at the same time, we are being stolen imperceptibly from ourselves. In this philosophical theater, it looks like the death of a friend is a sort of costume rehearsal. And you can stage it again and again with new friends in mind. Because of course, Seneca's friends are his own creation. Like Lucilius, like the so many other characters of the letters, Seneca advocates a friendship from afar, a friendship that is life in common, but is not life in proximity. It's life in common in what you have best. And again, a famous quote, even though we are separated by the sea, I will try to supply this help to you, taking your hand in mine, I will at once lead you away to a better life. And from here, I will mingle my talk with yours so that you may not feel alone. We will be together in the part of us where we are the best. We will give advice to each other, advice that will not depend on the facial expression of the listener. But the important thing is that we are together in that part in which we are the best. And there are numerous such statements in the letters, claims that we are more present to our friends when we are far away, because without the immediate proximity, the mind can concentrate better on its better part, on how the other appears, in what he has best, namely his animus rectus bonus magnus. So creating a friend means disclosing this God within, with the hope that while doing this for the other, I will also manage to do this for my own. Presumably, once this is done, these two parts of the divine spirit will recognize each other and enter in the kind of relationship I describe at the beginning of this paper as a passive model of friendship. If my interpretation is correct, this was made possible by what I called the active model of friendship, which thus becomes a condition of possibility for the Stoic conception of friendship. And let me end with what I take to be the most interesting suggestion of this new model that Seneca puts forward in the letters, the claim made in letter 6 that one can ultimately become one's own friend. And by doing so, quote, such a person will be a friend to everyone. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Donna. Any questions to begin with? Can I begin with question, and quite central to this active notion of friendship is the amicitiarum artifex. the idea of, in English, it actually comes out a little bit strangely to talk about making a friend, because normally, even in the passive sense that that Seneca is talking about, one talks colloquially about making friends, acquiring friends, but not literally making them in the sense of an artifact or an artifacts. And it's interesting, it's not amicus or amici artifacts, but amicitiarum, making of the crafting of a friendship. Or is it the crafting of a friendship or the crafting of friendship? Can you unpack that a little bit more, say a little bit more about this concept?
Well, again, if I'm right, then this is the making. So the act of shaping there is a generic act, which doesn't have anything to do with the particular life or the particular context of a friend. So in this sense, I take that quote about Phidias making statues of wood or marble. He knows how to make statues, and it doesn't really matter whether it is wood or marble. What I'm doing, I'm basically digging for the God within. And this digging for the God within is a bit more complicated by the fact that this is also a relation of reflection, because it's my God within digging for the God within. So in this kind of relation, the two parts of the spirit, because in the end our minds are two parts of the universal spirit, are shaping each other.
Why does he say? But why does he say an artifacts of friendship rather than of a friend? Isn't, because I mean the statue analogy does suggest, literally making a friend as opposed to the abstract concept, friendship.
Yeah, you're right.
The significance of that.
I only took it to be an acknowledgement of the genericity of this act, which is the same no matter where I'm performing it. So because again, what am I doing? I'm uncovering parts of the universal spirit. That human beings are just scattered parts of the universal spirit that happen to be, put into some bodies. And for the wise who already knows the law of nature, this act of creating friends or creating the friendship means uncovering these parts wherever they can be found in the universe. And it's part of the duty of the wise to do that, because the whole point of the universe is to uncover as much as these parts of wisdom, parts of reason that are scattered across the world, and kind of gather them together towards the final conflagration. So I took that term to mean not more than this generic act that the wise is doing. But I do understand that there might be a problem there, especially when it comes to what the sage is doing and what all the others are doing in the philosophical theater. Because if you are not a wise, you do not have this generic view of the universe and the others yet. Hence the need for all this theater, hence the need for the play, for characters, so I suspect that at this level, there's something else going on, which is we all have a natural tendency to sociability, an instinct of conciliation, an instinct of friendship, an instinct of attachment, let's say, not friendship, an instinct of attachment to others, from which it follows, some affinities might follow, but they are unreflected and they are basic. And the point of the letters is how do I get from there, which is the basic instincts and following my instincts, to a reflected art of making friends and making friendship. And that's reflected, I think, all this story about the active notion of friendship.
Well, I have more, but more questions. But Dolores has something to add that I think is relevant to this discussion.
So thank. Oh, so sorry. I have to unmute.
You're unmuted.
Yeah.
Now you are muted.
Now you are muted.
Now I'm fine. Okay.
Okay, there you are.
So the danger of a presentation like this is that you put us all to shame, and we all want to be your friends because it sounds like you're better than we are. So I mean, better than we are because you have this sort of global concept of, what it is to be a perfect human being and to be a friend at the same time. So what I was curious about is how you reconcile these views you have about friendship. Well, I mean, really, it's a follow-up on Dan's question about how can we think about friendship as a techne, because that's not the natural way to think about friendship. I don't think about when I want to be a friend of you or Dan or Claudia. I don't think, oh, how can I get them to be my friend? And there's a sort of craftiness element to that, which is completely at odds with the presentation you've just given. So if you could expand on this idea about how Seneca is thinking about friendship as a techne, that might clarify Dan's point. But then it's connected to, and how it's connected to being a friend to oneself, but also being a doctor to oneself. Because if Stoicism's goal in the end is to be self-sufficient, that seems at odds with both needing friendship for the human good, but at the same time needing to be self-sufficient. So this being a doctor to oneself is I think the theme of therapy of the passions, which is of course central to Stoicism. So there are a lot of these sort of concepts that are evoked in your paper, but I'm not exactly sure how to connect all of them. Maybe you could give us a story.
Well, I tried to give you a story. Let me try to rehearse the story. The story is the following.
Give us more details, yes.
Seneca at last has time to think, and it's quite urgent, get it right. And let's put it crudely, he realizes that it doesn't really work because the medicine of the mind practice upon yourself leaves you with this God within. Now, if you add to this a bit of background, you can imagine that Seneca, with his life and his story, would have found it difficult to rehearse all his sins every single night. So what you get in this self-reflection is something that is difficult to bear. It's the unknown inside of us. And I think that Seneca basically discovers something like this and finds a way out to construct what in modern terms we name intersubjectivity. I mean, a lot has been written about the Senecan selves of the letter, that in this process of writing the letter, Seneca basically puts himself into all sorts of selves and so on. I'm trying to simplify that and to say that since meditation doesn't let me too far away, it just led me to defining the fact that I have this mysterious God within me and it's a sick man. Then the way out is to construct intersubjectivity with the help of this thing called friendship. Now, that this is not the natural or the Aristotelian notion of friendship. It's not even Seneca's notion of passive friendship, which is a friendship, a natural bond between the wise. This is an act of creation. And what we see in the letters is Seneca's attempt to create these friends. And if you look at the letters from the perspective of this gallery of friends, then you find an amazing number of them. And you can see that what Seneca is doing. There is a bit of this artisanship of painting them, of creating them, of making them move and putting them in relation to each other, putting them in relation with himself. And he takes this to be the basic pedagogy of teaching and learning that will lead you eventually to what you want to achieve, namely animus rectus bonus magnus, and a mind well organized, and the ultimate step you have to do, namely to take yourself into possession, to affirm your freedom. And for this, you need friends, but again, they are not natural friends, they are not philosophical friends in the sense of the Epicurean garden, they are not even Stoic friends in the sense of the wise through which I'm living. I skipped that part. There is another part in which she's saying the same kind of make friends with books, make friends with Socrates, which doesn't mean live in a library, live somehow in Socrates. That means transform in some ways, make the books your own. There is a famous story about acting like a bee that is collecting things from books and then makes honey out of it. The same with Socrates. What does it mean to befriend Socrates? Well, clearly that means, in a way, changing Socrates. And letter 104 has a very interesting portrait of Socrates, which is very, well, it's a kind of different portrait of Socrates, insisting on some things that are Seneca's Socrates. So you do have in the letters the example of this masterful creation of characters that I take to be the active notion of friendship. And I take this philosophical theater to be part of the process of self-knowledge, because I use these creations, and Seneca uses these creations as he uses Lucilius, as ways of healing his mind, as ways as mirrors in which he mirrors himself, as alter egos on which he works to recover some features of his own life, of his own mind, and so on. So that's the story told once again. I don't know whether it's clearer this way.
Thank you. Joe Green? You have to activate your microphone. There.
There we go. I had just a couple of questions, but I think the one that I'm most inclined to ask has to do with the sort of theme of self-sacrifice. That was surprising to me. I haven't read a bunch of Seneca, but that seemed to be a kind of odd feature of the expression of friendship, of active friendship. So I just wondered if you could say a bit more about that.
Yes, again, here so there is a lot of secondary literature which claims that Seneca is obsessed and morbid and obsessed with death and, morbid about death. And indeed, if you look at depictions of death in the letters, there are a huge number of them. And there are all sorts of grim deaths. Now, my interpretation of this is that that's not at all, it doesn't have anything to do with morbidity or anything of this stuff. Is the following, it responds the following problem. What does it mean to die a philosophical death? most of our deaths are not. I mean, for Seneca somehow makes okay, let me put it differently. In the letters, very early on, Seneca says, the hemlock is part of Socrates' greatness. So death is the supreme philosophical act. Dying well is a kind of self-confirming yourself that you have lived well. So the whole stories about deaths in the letters are about deaths that were not philosophical deaths, and he's discussing why they were not. What's wrong with those? Why is not suicide always a philosophical death? Because it's not. Why is not even justified suicide a philosophical death? Because it's not. One reason to discuss this is because one would be tempted to say, well, if calamities are the basic teaching instrument, then let's just die and end up with it, and we go back to where we belong, and so that's it. But that's of course not a philosophical death. So again, the question is, which calamities, which situations of self-sacrifice, murder, torture, dying for someone else are philosophically justified, are morally good, and which are not? And evaluation of a moral act means evaluating the intention. An act is good or bad according to the intention of the act. Now, how do you evaluate the intention? That's the whole point. Now, dying for a friend has already a good intention there in the inside. So self-sacrifice is a kind of safe from the perspective of having some sort of good intention. It's not the whole point, because we have also to demonstrate that this is not a hypocritical kind of self-justification. But in principle, dying for another, self-sacrificing yourself is an act that results from a good intention, and therefore it's a good act, and therefore it can lead to a philosophical death. So that's why, and friendship is also defined in terms of facing various calamities. Death is just one, but the idea is to go for the other in the exile, pay your friend debts, and so on. You can do all sorts of things for your friend, trying to console your friend who have lost a child or have lost another friend. All these are things you do for your friend, and they are, you learn from them because they are hardships and calamities, and you also do what you're doing, these acts of friendship, with good intention. You also take yourself out of the picture, because, as we know, one of the problems with our development of moral self and healing the mind is self-love and so on. So every time I'm doing something for myself, I'm suspicious.
Okay, thank you. That helps. I guess my question was a bit about the meaning of for when it comes to dying for another. But the emphasis on the intention is certainly a helpful part of the answer there. So thank you. And my thanks to the organizers as well as the presenters today. Great papers. I appreciate the opportunity to having heard them. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, Joe.
Bye.
Dennis has a question.
So I want to ask about the appropriateness of calling the active friendship a friendship with God. So the question is what the relata of the relationship of friendship is. If it's a relationship between a human being and a human being, and or the God within the other human being, or the God within me and the God within the other human being. Now, if we say that it is the it is the God within the other that I love, it makes it harder to see what I am doing when I'm trying to better it. Because I'm probably not bettering the God within the human being who I'm calling my friend when I'm cultivating this relationship, but making the person, the man, better by carving out the superfluous things. So it looks like the relationship should be between a human being and a human being, in which case one might call it the best kind of relationship, best kind of friendship, most rational kind of friendship, but not a friendship with God. So I was wondering what makes this friendship with God.
Well, let me first say that I haven't uttered the word love tonight on purpose, because it's not at all clear how love comes into the picture. Seneca is a bit ambiguous about that, and that's the subject of another paper. This is clearly not love, though. There is even a letter where he says love is a friendship that has gone wrong. So love is not part of the active friendship.
If it came out of my mouth, it was by accident. That wasn't intended. I think the point can be made without uttering the word love at all.
I would go even one step forward and say that active friendship is not really a relationship. It's really an act of creation. The fact that at some point, at the end of an act of creation, a relationship is established, that's not part of the active friendship. In fact, this is how love is produced. Seneca says in one letter, "You are not yet my friend. You love me because you respond with love to my generosity." And that's not part of what we are talking here. So active friendship means shaping the other, finding the God within. And as a result of that, you can get the response, generosity and love and so on from the person who you shaped.
You're shaping the person, you're not shaping the God within the other person. So
you don't shape the God. I mean, the God is there, but you somehow
Yes, that's why I'm saying that the object.
Yes, I know what you're saying, but the point is that you disclose that God. So shaping amounts in the end to finding the right part of the mind, to find that spiritus, the animus rectus bonus magnus within the other.
Okay.
And when he says we are friends in what we have the best, we are at the point where there is a relationship. The relationship will be between the best part of my mind and the best part of your mind. But that's the passive model of friendship. So the active model of friendship makes this possible. Shapes the statue of the person, gets to the best part of the other's mind. Somehow this reciprocates, is not entirely clear how, and the passive model of the friendship of the wise is possible, which is a relationship between the two gods, the two minds, the two best parts of our minds. So all this statue analogy, in a way, we think we shape a statue, but they thought, didn't they, that they dig into a block of marble and get the statue out of there. In this sense, I read this shaping. So it's not. I don't have any saying in shaping. I'm not. Again, especially the philosopher, the proficient, doesn't have a model to shape his friends after that model. It's more like digging into the other and getting to this best part of the mind, or helping himself to get to this best part of the mind. So in this sense, I'm saying that the active model of friendship, it's not a relationship between persons, but it is an act of the philosopher to disclose the God within the other.
So, if I may ask quickly,
is quickly
friendship with God the passive to be understood on the passive model, and this is active friendship, is not really what friendship with God is.
I still have to think about it.
Okay.
I'm afraid that we've come to the end of the session, and my apologies to Jack Stetter, whose question is on the chat. Maybe you can correspond about it later. But this was a great session. Thank you both to Ryan and to Donna for a wonderful session. This is our last session for the fall series. We're taking a bit of a break. We will begin again in early February. Hopefully you will be getting, we will be publicizing the schedule in the not too distant future. Have a wonderful holiday, a wonderful January, and I hope that we'll see you all back in February. Thank you very, very much.
Happy
Thank you.
holidays, everyone.